depressing things I ever saw about Tony Blair was on the night Mrs. Thatcher died, he was on the telly saying, "I believed it was my job to build on what she'd achieved, not roll it back." Well, Peter Bugger didn't tell us that when he was running for the leadership of the Labour Party. And this is part of our problem. We live within a lie. 5 billionaires own 70% of the papers people read. The Barclay brothers control the Telegraph, Lord Rothermere, the Mail Group, and of course the most evil of all, Murdoch's empire. And we're constantly told about the horrors of the past, how Thatcher and Reagan saved the Western world, broke the unions, reduced taxes. Well, actually didn't quite reduce taxes. I mean, Thatcher cut taxes for the rich, but she doubled bloody VAT as soon as she got in. They just shifted the tax burden. And this is, I think, the tragedy of why we didn't win the election this year. We didn't have a coherent economic alternative to this neoliberal nonsense we've had to live with for the last 35 years. And I was born in 1945, just about 6 weeks before Labour won that election. And that election gave my generation the best quality of life in human history. Free education, free healthcare, everyone got a job. And the defining thing about Attlee, one of the great things about Attlee, he didn't read the bloody papers, so he didn't waste his time. He read the cricket scores, that was about the rest of it. He didn't worry what the newspapers were saying, he got on and did what he thought was right. And that Attlee government came to power, and the British debt at the end of that war was 2.5 times what it is today. They didn't say we need austerity to pay off the debt. They committed themselves to full employment, rebuilding our manufacturing base, creating a welfare state, a fair tax system. And oddly enough, because Attlee's generation won that economic debate, when the Tories got in 51, they broadly carried on with Labour's agenda. I can remember Tory shadow cabinet ministers coming to Lambeth in the late 60s and early 70s, promising to build more council houses than the Labour government. And this is the thing, only 2 elections in my lifetime have really changed things. Attlee in 1945 and then Thatcher in 79. And I think we are now at a point where we can change things again. But it has to be about winning that economic debate. We have to show people how we can make a better Britain without bankrupting ourselves or filling ourselves with vast amounts of debt. And that's why, I would have voted for Jeremy, but I've known him for about almost 50 years. We were campaigning together to get a proper radical Labour GLC in the early 80s. He was on his council in the 70s when I was. We've been on all these issues for yonks. But I'd be voting for him now if I'd never met him. Because you go on the website and you see he's got an economic strategy. I looked at Yvette Cooper's, and she did an article in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago. 80% of it was attacking the Tories. Absolutely right. But it got to the end, it had a few nice aspirations about we need to rebuild our economy and all that, but nothing about how you're going to do it, how you're going to pay for it. What's striking about Jeremy's website is there's detailed stuff there about how we can do it and how we can pay for it. And what I find electrifying about this is some of us on Labour's NEC were urging Ed Miliband and Ed Balls to adopt that economic agenda in the run-up to the last election. And it's basically just 2 key factors. To reverse the nightmare we've been through these last 35 years. Because if you look at inequality in Britain, the old graphs that the historians do, inequality in Britain in the period just before the First World War was enormous. And then from 1945 through to 79, it dramatically reduced. It was halved. We're back to where we were in 1914. Inequality has doubled. Half of all the wealth that's been created in Britain since the banking crash has gone to the top 1%. And the thing is, of course, if it goes to the top 1%, they don't spend it in their local bloody shop and create work. They invest it in stocks and bonds and racketeering, or they buy another bloody yacht in Monaco or something. And what I find remarkable now, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which most likely doesn't have a bloody lefty in either of them, both of them have now come out and said what's holding back the economies in Europe and America is the increase in inequality. The International Monetary Fund has said that if we hadn't had the increase in inequality in Britain, our economy would be 20% larger, and they're most likely underestimating that. So how do we tackle all of this? I mean, we want to see more teachers, we want to see more nurses, more doctors, but they have to be paid for. We want to see our infrastructure modernised. I mean, it took me an hour to get here on the tube, because it's racketing along on rails that, you know, most likely have been like that for about the last 50 years. You go to Shanghai or Beijing in China, where they've just built modern underground systems the size of ours. My God, it's so quick and so fast. And the key thing about this is investment in infrastructure is the key to economic success. I mean, every major economy has risen on the back of investment. Don't worry about the hedge fund managers and all this sort of tinkering with, you know, debt and gambling. It's the infrastructure. Think about this. I mean, 200 years ago, Britain became the greatest power on earth for 100 years. We were only 2% of the world's population, but we were the first economy ever to invest 7% of our GDP. America, after its Civil War, started investing 19%, and they dominated the 20th century. West Germany led Europe out of the chaos of the war and created a really good, broad economy for most people. In their best year, in 1973, they invested 25%. Japan went from basket case to the second biggest economy in the world. In 1969, they invested 38%. China today, which has gone from, you know, in 30 years, from absolute poverty to about to overtake America, they're investing 45%. What are we doing? 14. In 1973, our best year, we did 20%. And that's the key. Investing, modernise, infrastructure, invest in research and development. And all we've had for this last 35 years under Thatcher and Blair has been about, well, what do the hedge fund managers want? What does the financial sector want? I mean, when Thatcher got elected, 2% of workers in this country worked in the financial sector. Today it's 8%. But that might, good jobs, yes, but we lost 6 million jobs in manufacturing. Because the trade-off is, the bankers want high interest rates, that kills your investment in modernising our industry. Look at Germany today. Youth unemployment's a third what it is here. Their manufacturing sector's twice the size of ours. They never allowed their banks to become the masters of their economy. Their banks invest in modernising their firms. They lend to industry. Lending from our banks to our businesses has been pathetic since that economic disaster back in 2008. So what's crucial about this is, I look at Jeremy's thing, he understands that. He knows you've got to shift our economy. If we want a society in which my kids and my grandchildren have the quality of life that I had, we have to make real change. We can't carry on in all the bankers. I mean, when I was mayor, I had loads of dealings with Labour ministers, and they turn out and say, I just met a hedge fund manager. He's had a £10 million bonus for a deal he did last week. And I mean, the idea this is going to benefit all of us? No, it bloody well wasn't. It's been a disaster. And so Jeremy's got two key commitments that can change Britain. One is to use quantitative easing to modernise our infrastructure. And look, since the banking crisis, the Bank of England created £375 billion of new money and pumped it into the financial sector to prevent the banks collapsing. And it worked. They haven't collapsed, hasn't created inflation, there's been no bad consequences. So if we can create money to save the banks, why can't we create money to modernise our transport infrastructure, to have a broadband system that's as good as you get in Taiwan or Hong Kong, to build homes for workers so they can be within easy reach of where they need to work. And the key thing about that is it creates employment. It's quite interesting. The Economist, which is, I mean, no bloody leftists work at The Economist. Last week they had an article saying, if you invest in infrastructure, for every pound you invest, your economy in Britain will grow by £2.50. And so it's madness. I've watched Yvette Cooper and all the others sort of just dismissing this idea of using quantitative easing to invest. But I'll tell you this, look at London in the last 15 years. When I became the mayor, big businesses were saying to me, we're thinking of leaving London. It isn't working. And I managed to persuade Blair and Brown to put billions of pounds into modernising our transport. Not enough, but it made a difference. Crossrail opens in a couple of years. And once you start investing in infrastructure, then firms come and invest in your city. And that's what we need to do for the whole nation. So that's how you pay to modernise our infrastructure. And of course it doesn't create debt. I mean, the Bank of England prints the money, they own the resources. Hopefully they'll, if they want to, sell them off to our pension funds, not to some bloody foreign Russian oligarch or something like that. I mean, so it doesn't create debt. You can modernise Britain without borrowing more. And then it's the question, how do you pay for the nurses and the teachers that you want? And here, and once again, Jeremy's being rubbish bold at this, but I've been saying for years that if you look at the scale of tax evasion and avoidance in Britain, it's at least 120 billion, and it might be 150 billion. Of course, we don't know, because they're all, you know, funneling it to all these dodgy Cayman Islands and Swiss banks and things like that. But if we make the buggers pay their tax, we can actually employ the people we need in our health service, our schools, without having to increase tax. So how do you do it? And there's one simple way. They employ the brightest lawyers and accountants on the face of the planet to avoid paying tax. But the one tax they can't avoid paying is their business rate, because it's a flat tax. So why don't we think in terms of, for Starbucks and Google and the others, a tax on turnover? I mean, Starbucks, I don't think, has paid a penny of bloody tax in this country for a decade. But if Starbucks had to pay a tax of 10% on every cup of coffee they sell, they can't avoid that. They can't fund it through Switzerland or anywhere else. And standing up to these giant international corporations who don't just rob us, they rob everywhere. They don't pay tax anywhere. I mean, so there's vast wealth on the face of our planet and in this country, but it's being just not paying its fair share. So we can do the things we want to do without having to increase tax on ordinary working class and middle class families. And that's why I think Jeremy's campaign has taken off. He's talking seriously about real change. And all over the Western world, this last 35 years, under Thatcher and Reagan, we were told, smash the unions, cut taxes on corporations, deregulate the banks, and our economies will rise. Well, that's the truth. In the years since Thatcher came to power, the British economy grew by 100%. In the 30 years before, it grew by 150, when we had strong trade unions, a top rate of tax of 98%, and massive regulation of the banks. Exactly the same is true in America. So let's fall for all these lies we get from the Mail and the Telegraph and the Times and the Sun. We are the 6th richest nation on the face of the planet. We can do these things. And this huge influx of people is because finally we've seen someone running for the leadership of the Labour Party who's talking about giving the next generation a chance in life. That's crucial. I've got 5 kids. I'm supporting Jeremy because I want them to have a decent life. I don't think we'll get it with any of the other candidates. And all my life I've been waiting for another Labour government as game-changing as the Attlee one. I'm as disappointed by Wilson and Callaghan and Blair and Brown. And I watched all of them end up all being nervous and nerdy and all of that. What I love about Jeremy is he just says what he thinks and he believes in what he says, and that's what's connecting with people. I do a radio programme every Saturday morning with David Mellor, and it works because he hates this government as much as I hated the last Labour government. And we were talking about Jeremy Corbyn on Saturday, And all the people phoning in, UKIP voters and Tory voters saying, I like Jeremy. And there's two factors that win you an election. One is having an economic strategy, which sadly we didn't have this May, otherwise the heads would be in Downing Street. But there's actually another, and it's the sort of nice point I'll end on. Think back to 1992. We assumed we were going to win that election under Neil Kinnock against John Major. And two factors. One, our economic strategy, it wasn't bad actually, but it was demonised by the Sun that we were going to vastly increase the tax on nurses and teachers and that, which is a total lie. But the other factor was people thought John Major was a nice guy. And I've known Jeremy for nearly 50 years. I've never once seen him lose his temper. I've never seen him be rude to anyone, and I can't say that about myself, I have to say. And people say, well, and a lot of these awful old Blairites are saying, you know, if Jeremy wins, we'll be in opposition for generations. I wouldn't vote for Jeremy if I didn't think he could win the general election, because I want change for my kids. I'm voting for Jeremy because I think he can win the election, but then he has the strength of character and the backbone to change this nation for the better. Vote for Jeremy. Thanks for that. My only disagreement with Jeremy is he doesn't drink. I do. Question time.
Okay, does anyone have a question for Ken?
One of the real big problems that our society faces at the moment is mental health. With 1 in 4 people in our society experiencing mental health problems, that means around 40 people in this room become directly experiencing mental health. I mean, some estimates put the impact of this on our GDP at around 160 billion pounds a year. How much attention do you think this much money is paying to mental health as it works for the future?
Right, I honestly don't know the details of that, but I don't have the slightest doubt. The best way of tackling this is we increase spending on the NHS, but also we give more money to local councils to provide the support locally that people who have problems need. And then I also think to myself, it does feel like mental health problems are getting worse. And it's not just because we leave so many people behind. Whole communities get left behind. People end up, you know, out of work, not just for years, but for decades. You need to involve people. And I think a society that's more open and more equal will have less mental health problems. And also a society in which we reconnect. I mean, I grew up in that post-war Britain where nothing was wasted. Now we live in a society where so much is wasted and so damaging in environmental terms. But also, I mean, when I started work in 1962 at the Royal Marsden in Fulham Road, the technicians there, people were much more engaged with each other because you came to work at 9, you left at 5. You had an hour's lunch break and you had 2 half-hour coffee breaks and you had time to communicate. People now are under the most incredible pressure. I mean, it's not just they don't get much time to talk to their friends at work, they don't get time to talk to their family. I mean, people are working all the hours God sends. We've got to get back to a society in which people have the time to relate to each other. We've lost a lot of that in the last 30 years, and I suspect that's a big part of what's led to increasing mental health problems.
Okay. We have another question here.
Thank you, Ken. Nice to see you again. Will Stooley, one of Navi Shah's entourage from Harrow, I'm sure you remember.
Yeah.
Can I say, sterling performance yesterday on any questions. You absolutely flounced the right-wingers on that programme. I got the Dorchester crowd behind you. It was marvellous. And you gave me an idea when you said, I didn't know this, and you said that when the Indians in East Africa were ousted by the Amin and so forth, you sorted out with Ted Heath to take, was it 10,000, I think you said, into Brent? That gave me an idea. I've been wondering what the answer to the Syrian crisis was. I wonder what your opinion or Jeremy Corbyn's campaign would say to this. Why don't we just campaign to Europe to take as many of them as we can? If we did, you've got 26 countries in Europe, there's 20 million Syrian citizens, so I'm reliably informed. There's 8 million in London, it's almost double just one city. If we took them all, spread over 26 European countries, The only thing that the Syrian government and ISIS would have to fight over is a load of dust and then rockets and guns that they're left with. There'd be nothing else to fight for. Do you not think that the real answer to this is to take as many Syrian refugees as the whole Europe can, resettle them, and let's face it, they're going to start work, they're going to start paying taxes, it's going to be beneficial to everybody, they're going to be happy, and it's a much better idea that I totally agree with Corbyn. There's no point going in there rocketing guns and sorting out. It's been proved so many times over that it doesn't solve the situation.
Well, one of our problems is the nightmare you've got in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria is for 100 years. Britain and America and France have been intervening. These were colonies we exploited. Then we propped up dictators. When the Iranians elected a democratic socialist government in 1952 and they nationalised the oil for the benefit of their own people, we intervened and overthrew that government, and it led to the Ayatollah. In 1979, the CIA went to see Jimmy Carter in the White House and said, the Russians are very worried about Muslim fundamentalists in Afghanistan. If we give them arms, the Russians will invade, it will become their Vietnam. And Carter signed that. The Americans started giving arms to fundamentalist Muslim groups, and that lit the fuse that led to 9/11 and 7/7 on the streets of London. And this is the problem. The West has created this nightmare. I mean, do you remember Cameron saying, we're going to get rid of Gaddafi, we'll bomb him, get rid of him? And what we've now got, half of Libya is controlled by an ISIS-type group, creating great terror. I mean, we have a real responsibility. And the point you made about, I wasn't actually in Brent at the time, I was on Lambeth Council, but the Heath government, a Tory government, went to Brent Council and I think to Hillingdon and said, will you each take 10,000 refugees from Uganda because the dictator Idi Amin's expelling all the agents. Brent took 10,000 refugees into one borough, equivalent to 4% of the population. But Heath's government gave that council the money to build more homes, to provide support, and it caused no problems at all. Can you imagine Cameron doing this? I watched the disgusting man on telly earlier this week. Oh, no, if we take any refugees, it will just encourage others, or something like that. And then after we see a dead body of a child, now saying he's going to take some. The most unprincipled Prime Minister I've known in my lifetime, and that's a rich field to see from. So no. Look at one other thing. London's boomed because we did a lot on infrastructure. It's also boomed because we're the most open city. One of the things I'm proudest of is that after the bombings on the bus and the tubes in 2005, there wasn't a single incident the police recorded where a Muslim was attacked in this city or a mosque was daubed. People didn't turn against each other. This is the most open city, and it is the only city in Europe that matches American levels of productivity and competitiveness. And that, I think, is a clear sign. Closing borders is ridiculous. We now live in a global world. We should be open, but you can't take refugees if the government isn't there helping and supporting, and that's what they've got to do. Absolutely right.
Another question?
Sarah Hurley, Vauxhall Ward, GMB trade unionist. Ken, fantastic to meet you again. I'd like to ask, when Jeremy wins this leadership election, as I believe he will, because he's a people speaker, do you feel that the Labour machine or the rest of Labour will finally get the hint and support him fully in his leadership campaign?
Well, there will be some grumpy old people hanging around, but the thing about Jeremy is he's inclusive. Jeremy is about debate. I mean, when I joined the Labour Party, it was a genuine democratic structure. In our local ward meeting, we discussed what the policies should be. Motions went out to annual conference, they were agreed, voted on, and then Blair came along. All that was shut down. We don't have a say or an influence. Maybe one of the best things Ed Miliband did was he reversed Blair's decision that you couldn't select the candidate you wanted for Parliament in your local area unless they'd been vetted by the Labour machine. When I stood for Parliament the first time in '79, I just turned up at the local party, they voted for me, the NEC endorsed that. Then under Blair, if you wanted to be a Labour candidate, you had to go to a hotel on the south coast for a weekend, where all these officials quizzed you about what you believed. And if you didn't say all the right things, they didn't let you stand. That's outrageous. And Miliband did away with that, which is why the new intake, much more pro-Corbyn. Now the key thing here, I think, about making sure the party works under Jeremy, is it will be open. Jeremy won't announce policies from the top and impose them. He'll start a debate that comes up from grassroots, like people like yourself, actually going to meetings, saying what things, going up to annual conference, reinstating that democracy that we lost. Under Blair, 60% of Labour members left. In this last 2 months, our membership has absolutely doubled. We've got to reach out to those people, and also to the people that just paid the £3 to vote. Get them involved, get them campaigning on local issues. I was talking earlier tonight to someone who's campaigning against massive destruction of social housing replaced by luxury flats. That's happening all over London. We've got to become a grassroots campaigning party again. And that will move a lot of these reluctant MPs who aren't voting for Jeremy. If we start surging ahead in the polls, they'll all be licking his backside like a loving dog, you know?
Another question here.
David Watson from Walthamstow constituency. I've long been an admirer of yourself and Jeremy and the sort of ethical stance you've taken towards arms sales to Middle Eastern countries. And whenever I've met with Stella Creasy, I've tried to press her on arms sales to Israel, and can we have a two-way embargo on sales to and from Israel. Jeremy himself has expressed support for this stance. You've both been very supportive of the Palestinians. Do you think that sort of policy is realisable? I mean, we saw when Robin Cook was Foreign Secretary, he tried to have a more ethical foreign policy, and to some extent he wasn't able to sustain that. Do you think that Jeremy could sustain such a policy if he were Labour leader? Could we have a two-way arms embargo against Israel, for example?
Well, it's quite interesting because if you look back at the election, the polling analysis shows, I mean, for the first time in perhaps ever, we went into that election with a leader who was Jewish. But the Jewish vote went 69% Tory, 22% Labour. Because Ed Miliband said, you can't carry on with the situation in the Middle East. There has to be pressure on Israel to come to a solution. I mean, people have been living in refugee camps in Gaza and in Jordan since 1948, and it hasn't created peace. And there's got to be some sort of compromise there. Think back to Northern Ireland. When I got my maiden speech in Parliament was about Northern Ireland. I was denounced by all the media. I said, you've got to negotiate with the IRA. But I'd spoken to our army leaders in Northern Ireland. They all said, we can never defeat the IRA. Every time we kill one, 10 people come along and apply to join. And when I met Jerry Adams, he said, we know we can't defeat the British Army. I mean, the Army and the IRA knew that to be a political solution, but Thatcher just refused ever to do that. And perhaps Tony Blair's greatest achievement is actually breaking out of that and ending that. And that's what we've got to do in the Middle East. We have to say, part of the problem has been broadly, British and American governments more than British, just broadly endorse whatever Israel does. We have to say many of the things you do there are fundamentally wrong. I mean, there are only 6 schools in Israel where Jewish and Arab kids sit side by side. That is ridiculous. I mean, there's no future in all of that. And someone like Netanyahu, I mean, is a horrendous leader that's made matters worse and worse. We do need to apply pressure to Israel. Say, you want support from the West? Right, you reach out to the Palestinians that you need to live with, involve them in your economy, make sure they all have a right to vote, make sure they get involved, create a genuine country that combines those two separate faiths.
Another question here?
Hi Ken, as I'm sure the Londoners in this room are painfully aware, Britain's got a housing problem. And I think the contenders for London Mayor and for leadership, they're seeing that this is an issue, and they're all talking about it. But why is it that you think Jeremy is best placed to deal with this issue, and how's he going to deal with it?
Well, the key thing is this, though. When I came into politics, as I said, the parties competed to build more council housing. I mean, Tories would say we'll build more council housing than Labour. And if you look at France and Germany, about half the people live in rented accommodation, half in owning own homes, have got mortgages. This nonsense that one day we must all buy our own home, it doesn't work for a lot of people, particularly if you're moving around a lot. It's a nightmare. You need to create a good, reasonable rented sector. And I can remember, I think it was Peter Walker, the Tory minister, coming to Brixton saying no one should pay more than 10% of their income in rent. Well, bloody hell, that would be amazing today, wouldn't it? And the thing I'm most angry about Tony Blair is not just the war in Iraq, but the failure to build council housing. I mean, Thatcher stopped it, and we carried on with that ban. And it's nonsense. I mean, when I was mayor, we identified enough brownfield sites in London to build 1/3 of a million homes. Now, that's a 10-year house building programme. And when I was chair of housing in Camden, we put compulsory purchase orders on sites that developers weren't developing. We can do this, we can tackle it. But the question is, how do you pay for it? And that's why Jeremy's quantitative easing issue is the key. I mean, the Bank of England prints the money to buy the land, to build the homes, they then get the rent in, they give it to a local council to run or whatever. This is the way forward. I mean, I just look around London now, it's unbelievable. The home I live in, I bought 26 years ago for £155,000. Today it's worth £1 million. I'm not better off. I've got 5 kids who can't afford to buy a home. And we're worse off because of that. We need to stop all these Russian oligarchs coming over here and buying £100 million flats and things like that. I've seen developments in Tower Hamlets where there's an entry for the rich and then an entry beside for the poor. This should be illegal. You wouldn't allow an entry for blacks and an entry for whites. Why allow an entry for rich buggers and for poor people? And Jeremy lives in a constituency where housing's as big a crisis is out here. He will tackle that problem, and that's the way we pay for it.
Okay, one more question.
Ken, hi. Niamh O'Brady, I'm a representative from Unite the Union. I sit on the National Political Committee and I'm on the London Regional Board. I'm really hoping that on Saturday we're going to have a Jeremy Corbyn win. And what I really want people here to do, though, is to realise that we really have to stop focusing on our own internal debate and start opposing the Tories. And so on the 16th of September, we're going to have the second reading of the Trade Union Bill, which is the most partisan, ideologically driven attack on ordinary 7 million trade unions that we've ever seen. And so the right to strike, which is almost impossible already, is going to be taken away. The police are going to be politicised, they have to be involved. On every picket line, there has to be an official steward. You have to give 14 days notice of the right to strike, 50% turnout to have an industrial dispute. If these Tories were elected on a 50% mandate, my God, 25%, and this is where they are. So can we all get out there, lobby the MPs, let's have a debate, let's take them on. I'm certainly hoping, I don't see that the Tories will give this bill away, but I hope that this is going to be their poll tax moment. 7 million people and the rest of us, it's changed, the debate's changed, let's move on and let's oppose them, not emulate them.
Absolutely. I mean, and you know Jeremy's going to be absolutely solid on this. I complained about Tony Blair not building council housing. I think it was appalling we didn't reverse all Thatcher's anti-union measures. I mean, because think about this. I mean, what's happened is the wages of ordinary working class and middle class families have eroded in real terms. And you need trade unions there fighting for those rights and defending it. And the undermining of trade unions is most likely the biggest single factor in the growth of inequality in our country. So we need to re-establish trade union rights. And the idea that you've got to get 50% people voting for you now, as you said, the Tories got elected on about 24%. I mean, it's just, I don't think there's ever been a government elected in Britain with 50% of the vote. I mean, the Labour government in 1951 got about 48% of the vote, but only on 80% turnout, so they wouldn't have been able to take office if this bloody rule applied to them. It's nonsense. The Tories will carry on doing anything they can to undermine the rights of ordinary people, so the small elite rich and the international banking class continue to rip us all off. So vote for Jeremy. He will lead the Labour MPs into the lobby opposing that. But also I have to say this, I'm in favour of actually saying the union should think in terms of major strike action to stop this. They've got a majority in Parliament, they most certainly got a majority in the House of Lords. We need to go onto the streets and say, you can't get away with this. You are not allowed to take away the rights of ordinary people while you sit around in your bloody elite little luxury clubs with your old Bullingdon boyfriends and all of that. No way. Can I just say as well, as I've got to dash off. I can't stop around and get absolutely fast with the rest of you because I've got to go to Brazil tomorrow because there's the annual conference of Brazilian mayors and they want me to tell them how to do a congestion charge.
Ken Livingstone, please give a round of applause. That's it.